All right. So my name is Wazhma Frogh, and on behalf of FARAGEER, I will be moderating today's webinar. The webinar is about unpacking the independent investigative mechanism for Afghanistan. I'm very grateful to FARAGEER and all our participants and speakers who have joined us. And to start the webinar, to kick us start, I would like to invite Latifa Majidi, who is a women's rights activist and a member of FARAGEER, to introduce FARAGEER to all of us, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you so much. Latifa John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wazhma. Distinguished speakers, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today from across the globe. I am honored to welcome you to this important webinar organized by FARAGEER, a women-led global forum for Afghanistan. Thank you for taking the time to be part of this critical conversation on accountability, justice, and the future of Afghanistan. We are especially grateful to our speakers, experts, advocates, and participants who bring diverse perspective and deep expertise to today's discussions. Your presence here reflects a shared commitment to ensuring that Afghanistan is not forgotten and that the human rights violations are neither normalized nor ignored. FARAGEER was founded to ensure that Afghan women, civil society actors, and democratic voices remain meaningfully included in international discussions and decision-making processes related to Afghanistan. The word FARAGEER means inclusive, and inclusion is at the core of everything that forum represents. Under the leadership of Ms. Nargis Nehan, former Afghan minister and long-standing advocates for human rights and gender equity, FARAGEER works at the intersection of policy, advocacy, and accountability. The forum serves as a platform to connect Afghan voices with international institutions, governments, and mechanisms, advocating for justice, political inclusion, and gender-responsive approaches to peace and governance. Today's webinar directly reflects that mission. Over the past several years, Afghanistan has experienced widespread and systematic violations of human rights. Women and girls disproportionately affected through exclusion from education and employment, restrictions on public life, and targeted policies that aim to erase them from society. Journalists, human rights defenders, minorities, and civil society actors have also faced repression, intimidation, and violence. In this context, the establishment of an independent investigation mechanism for Afghanistan is a significant and necessary step. Such a mechanism is designed to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence of serious violation of international law, ensuring that crimes are documented and the future avenues for accountability remains open. However, accountability mechanisms are only as effective as political will, expertise, and engagement that surrounds them. That is why today's discussion is so important. The webinar aims to unpack the independent investigation mechanism, to clarify its mandate, examine its potential impact, and explore how it can meaningfully engage with survivors, civil society, and Afghan women. We also reflect on its limitation and the role that international actors and advocacy platforms can play in strengthening its effectiveness. In FARAGEER, we believe that accountability is not about retaliations. It's about recognition, prevention, and justice. It is about ensuring that violations are not erased through silence or political convenience. For Afghan women, accountability is deeply personal. It's about dignity, agency, and the assurance that their experience matter in the eyes of international law. As a woman-led forum, FARAGEER brings distinct and necessary perspective to this conversation, one that centers survivors, highlight gender-based crimes, and insists that Afghan women are not passive victims, but essential stakeholders in justice and peace processes. We are honored today to be joined by distinguished speakers who will share their insight and analysis. I encourage all participants to engage actively, reflect critically, and continue to a discussion that is both substantive and looking forward. Let us use this space to reaffirm a fundamental principles. There can be no sustainable peace in Afghanistan without justice, and no justice without accountability. Thank you once again for joining us. We are honored to have you and to have expert speakers with us today. I now invite us to begin today's program.
All right, so then thank you, Latifa John, for giving us the introduction for FARAGEER, and grateful to Nargis John's leadership for bringing us all together under this umbrella. I would like to say that the situation in Afghanistan, as we all know, is not static. Every day it keeps changing. And for us to keep abreast of, to keep an understanding and a gist of what's going on the ground, we continue working with our colleagues on the ground. We continue hearing from women's activists, young women, women who have been protesting, women who are sitting at home but still mobilizing. So there are so much of what women are doing inside Afghanistan that we cannot hear many times. In that sense, I would like to invite one of our colleagues from Afghanistan, a women's rights activist. I'll try not to take her name, but a woman from Afghanistan who would share some of her perspectives on what's going on right now in Afghanistan and what does she think about this independent investigative mechanism, which is just a mouthful of so many words that come together, the UN jargon, but we'll see. And what does she tell us? So my colleague, I don't know what to call you, but we call you as a women's rights activist. We should have thought about the name for you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. As a women's rights activist from inside Afghanistan, for us, human rights violations are not something we read about or we discuss in meetings. They are part of our daily life. They affect our safety, our work, our families, and even our hopes for the future. When we talk about investigative mechanism for Afghanistan, I believe we need to focus much more on what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, there are ongoing and serious violations of human rights, especially against women and girls, minorities, former government employees, and those punished simply for who they are or what they did in the past. These violations, they need to be spoken up about openly, but more importantly, they need to be documented properly, carefully, reviewed, and preserved. So the truth is not lost, even if justice feels very far away right now. So at the same time, I want to be very honest about something. Documenting violations inside Afghanistan is extremely sensitive and risky. Every interview, every note, every piece of evidence, it can put lives in danger if it is not handled carefully. And this is why documentation and preservation must always consider security risks, cultural sensitivities, and the real fear people live with every day. As one survivor told me, she said that telling my story is not the dangerous part. Being identified is. I'm speaking to you today without showing my face or using my real name, because doing so, it might put me or my family at risk. And this shows the reality of speaking out in Afghanistan. Even telling the truth carries the danger. Another point I strongly believe is the importance of who's involved in this work. people who have worked inside Afghanistan for years, and the ones who understand the contexts, the risks, the language, and even the unspoken realities that should have much stronger role. Now, their experience, their judgment, their knowledge, it can prevent serious mistakes. And the decisions about roles, the responsibilities, it must be made very carefully because one wrong choice, it can put someone's life at risk, and not just professionally speaking, but personally. I also want to talk about the emotional side of this work. Investigating and documenting human rights violations is heavy. It is mentally and emotionally exhausting, especially in a country like Afghanistan, where the situation is unstable, constantly changing, and many people doing this work, they're carrying their own trauma while listening to the trauma of others. So to conclude, as a woman rights activist from Afghanistan, my hope is that this mechanism will truly hear the voices of Afghan women. It is essential that the perspectives and the experiences of women inside Afghanistan are considered, and that we have clarity on how we and the other Afghan women participants can engage with and benefit from this mechanism. Now, despite the many challenges we face, I want to express our deep appreciation to the Human Rights Council for adopting this mechanism. I mean, this step is particularly meaningful for Afghanistan, and we hope it will become operational soon. So it will be helping achieve justice for many Afghan women and protect their rights. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, my sister. These are very, very important insights, and we hope that as the process continues to take shape, and many of you inside Afghanistan and many of women who are in different provinces could be consulted. And we have Richard here, whom we would be kind of, keep asking for to become that voice. Imagine if 5 years ago we had this conversation, all of us would have been either in Park Star or Serena, or maybe at the Human Rights Commission having this conversation, all of us sitting there and having the chai and the cake and all that, vibrant days that we had, or we could hear nobody would have to hide their names or their identities, but that's not the story today. With that background, I'd like to formally open the panel. Today, we look at the independent investigative mechanism, مکانیزم مستقل تحقیقاتی بر افغانستان, which has been a mechanism that has been used in many other countries, particularly in Syria, Myanmar recently, that helps to deliver some sort of justice or hope for survivors and for international accountability. And our speakers bring perspectives from UN, international advocacy, feminist legal practice, and Afghan diplomacy. I'll briefly introduce our panelists here. Okay, so first of all, Richard Bennett, welcome. Richard serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. He brings decades of experience monitoring complex human rights crises. I met him in Afghanistan in Unama many years ago when I was still very young. Though I feel I'm still young, but those were very great days we had. He has worked extensively on accountability, protection of civilians, and documenting violations in challenging political environments. Welcome, Richard. Then we have Dr. Amrita Kapur, who is the Secretary General for WILPF, with deep expertise in gender justice, feminist peace building, accountability for conflict-related abuses. And her work focuses very much on ensuring that survivors are actually centered within the accountability approaches, and women's participation is actually strengthened in justice. Another dear colleague joining us, Akila Radhakrishnan. Sorry, Akila, if I'm not pronouncing your last name properly. Akila is a human rights lawyer and a leading gender justice expert who has worked internationally on accountability for grave human rights violations. She contributed to shaping legal strategies, advocacy, and frameworks to advance justice for marginalized and persecuted communities. When it comes to gender apartheid, Akila is a very important ally for Afghan women. And last but not the least, we have Mohibullah Taib, the Deputy Representative for Afghanistan Mission in Geneva. He is working at the intersection of diplomacy, human rights, and international engagement. He brings insights on how the political realities, international mechanisms, and Afghan voices inside and outside Afghanistan intersects in the pursuit of justice and accountability. And so thank you so much to all of you for joining us. I'd start with Richard. Richard, in this mechanism, particularly that we are talking about today, the Independent Investigative Mechanism, or IIM, whatever we kind of refer to it, from your perspective, what does this mechanism realistically mean, like your honest perspective, and what critical gaps is it trying to fill that can actually translate evidence into accountability, any political or major operational issues that you want to kind of predict, and how does the mechanism connect with your mandate? This is something we are very interested to hear from you. You and panelists will have 5 minutes each for the first questions, and then later on we would come back to you with another point of reflection. So the floor is yours, Richard. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Wazhma. I'd like to thank FARAGEER for organizing and hosting this really important webinar. I would also like to thank the woman human rights defender who spoke to us from Afghanistan just now and endorse what she said about it's difficult to do human rights monitoring and documentation. It's sensitive, and above all, we must do no harm while we're doing this important work. I also want to congratulate the very strong advocates who managed to convince the member states of the Human Rights Council to support the mechanism. They were from many NGOs inside Afghanistan and outside, and some member states. And one of our panelists, Mr. Mohibullah Taib, was a leading voice, and I congratulate him and all of you for getting this mechanism established. It took many years, and it was very difficult because in the human rights field these days, there is shrinking, not expanding. There's less money, less mechanisms. So many of you, and I think particularly Mr. Mohib, knows how difficult it was, but it was achieved. And this is a great achievement. I support this mechanism, and I supported it with the member states in the Human Rights Council and in other fora, and spoke alongside civil society. To answer the question, what does it realistically mean? Its establishment fills a gap because it will undertake investigations at a criminal standard of evidence. And I'm going to just quote from the resolution so I get it right. It will collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of international crimes and violations of international law committed in Afghanistan, including against women and girls, and prepare files in order to facilitate and expedite fair and independent criminal proceedings in national, regional, or international courts and or tribunals. So it is a criminal justice approach, and it fills a gap because my mandate, UNAMA's mandate, does not do that. Only the ICC is investigating at a criminal level. The rest of us are investigating and monitoring and gathering important information at a human rights standard of evidence. It will not have the authority to prosecute. However, the mandate gives it the authority or the duty to prepare files for others to prosecute. And that could include the ICC International Criminal Court, and it could include what we call universal jurisdiction, other states prosecuting. Others may speak about this. It also has what we call a comprehensive mandate. That is, it has the capacity to investigate international crimes perpetrated by any party in Afghanistan and during any time period. There's no time period specified and no focus on any particular actor or perpetrator. We don't know what its strategy will be or what its focus will be. That will be up to the mechanism itself, and particularly the head of the mechanism, who is yet to be appointed. How does it relate to the Special Rapporteur mandate? Well, my mandate continues in the same resolution. It was renewed for another year, and it's renewed annually. All UN mechanisms, my mandate and others, are required to cooperate with the mechanism. I'm just going to call it the mechanism as for short. And the mandate has a specific requirement on me. It says that the mechanism should build on the work and findings of the Special Rapporteur, and to this end, be able to make use of the relevant information collected by the Special Rapporteur with the consent of information providers as appropriate, and continue to collect evidence. So I am required to hand over the evidence that I've collected with the consent of the information providers. So I have an exercise. I need to go back to the information providers and ask them if they agree that I can hand over their information, because when I collected some of this information, the mechanism didn't exist, so I couldn't ask for that consent. The mechanism will make an annual report to the Human Rights Council on its main activities. So this is where there is another difference between the SR mandate and the mechanism. I report regularly to the Human Rights Council on the human rights situation, and I've been reporting most of all on the situation for women and girls. And my next report, next month actually, will also be on the situation for women and girls. This time I'm looking at the right to health for women and girls. This mechanism won't make those kind of regular public reports on the human rights situation. I'll continue to do that, and I expect that UNAMA and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights will do that. Then I think the last part of the question, and 5 minutes must be just about up, so I'll go through this very quickly, is what are the major political or operational issues? Well, it's not yet operational, so that's the issue. We have to get it operational. It needs resourcing, it needs funding. It can get what's called UN regular budget funding, and it can get voluntary funding. I understand from reading the reports from New York that 10 posts have been approved in the budget for 2026. It will be an incremental start. That was expected in the resolution. It will need to hire the head of the mechanism. That is an incredibly important job. We need that person. We need all the staff. We need the policies to be gender responsive and accessible to civil society. It will also need to establish its procedures. And I've just mentioned in that and in the mandate, it says adopt procedures that are multidimensional, gender responsive, and victim centered. So they need to be, that needs to be watched a lot. It needs to establish witness protection procedures. There will be a report to the next session on progress so far. That is at the end of February, early March. There will be a progress report. So in conclusion, I see this as part of the all tools approach. It's not a panacea. It is a really important contributor, along with others like the ICC, the Special Rapporteur, The case that's been taken by some countries under the CEDAW Convention, the advocacy for codification of gender apartheid, the People's Tribunal on Women and the follow-up to that, and of course, the application of universal jurisdiction. I think it is going to take a while to get operational, so I want to manage expectations on that, and perhaps we can come back to that discussion later. Thank you for the time. Back to you, Wazhma Jan.
Thank you, Richard. These are very important insights, particularly to colleagues who are joining from Afghanistan. And I want to recognize the conversations that are being held actually in the chat, especially from women and men working on very different human rights and development issues in Afghanistan, who are sharing their perspectives as well. And we really hope that they would actually find the opportunities through your office, Richard, but also through different other mechanisms, so that they can bring in their perspectives. And when we talk about, survivor-centered accountability, that it too is a mouthful. I would like to invite Dr. Amrita Kapur now, who can tell us, what does this mean? Like, what does survivor-centered accountability mean, especially in the context of Afghanistan? And if you want to share any lessons learned from other countries, how does it look like? I remember when Latifa John spoke, she talked about, we are not asking for retaliation, but justice. What does that mean? And also in terms of survivor-centered accountability that can prevent re-traumatization. So the floor is yours, Dr. Amrita Kapur, and your 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, both for the kind introduction and for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that it is an incredibly significant achievement, as Richard mentioned, not just because of the current context, but because we would not be here without this advocacy across a broad range of civil society and particularly women's groups to really have this as a landmark or a milestone. And so what I'll do is perhaps look at some general principles before turning actually to insights from women in Afghanistan, and then looking thirdly and finally at some of the lessons learned from the mechanisms of Syria and Myanmar, also in Geneva, with similar mandates. So I think the very first principle is really starting from the intersectional positionality of the survivor. And the first step is really looking at how this mechanism will be valuable to them in meaningful access to justice and participation as a process with integrity. And so there are some principles, as someone who specialized in gender justice in the last 20 years across over 20 countries, there are a lot of similar themes that we have learned, which is one, firstly, that it is an intentional strategy that is required by the mechanism to counter the default exclusionary structures, processes, biases, and norms that are often embedded not just in criminal justice processes, but in institutional processes. And this requires a strategy. And we see that from the mechanism from Syria, how important that was to anchor the rest of the initiatives. The second one is just recognizing this intersectional approach is critical to be able to identify and include the diverse experiences, expertise, wisdoms, and recommendations from women in diverse contexts within Afghanistan. And then if we look at this as an international justice mechanism, it's beholden upon all of those involved and the stakeholders in designing and implementing and iteratively reviewing the practices of the mechanism to close this distance between the survivors and international justice mechanisms in another country, in another language, which I'll speak to in a moment, and to recognize that we haven't yet achieved what we know is this truly integral and accessible and empowering process of justice. But we also have a window here to learn from previous institutions and recognize that the stakes are higher here because of the systematic context of gender apartheid in Afghanistan. So the impetus is there, and it's a very strong one. I want to turn to looking at insights and experiences from the ground. Late last year, the Afghan Women's Coordination Umbrella conducted a 3-day nationwide consultation with 220 Afghan women across all regions of the country, spanning activists, human rights defenders, women-led organizations, teachers, students, religious scholars, survivors, community elders on this mechanism. And I want to start by saying a striking 98% of participants had no knowledge of the mechanism. And this speaks to information barriers caused by language restrictions, the absence of local language communication, limited civic space, lack of engagement. But at the same time, once briefed, the participants welcomed the mechanism as a historic opportunity to preserve truth, document violations, and ensure future justice. So there were some really key themes that emerged, and I'll mention them broadly before a few specific instances. One was the centrality of trust building and recognizing, as Latifa mentioned at the very beginning, how fraught the context is in terms of security risks. Second one was obviously concrete actions to embed survivor-centered processes, robust confidentiality systems, and culturally grounded methods of engagement, as well as inclusive outreach. I think where we look at lack of awareness, and this leads to lack of access. And so we need to recognize that language and translations into Dari or Pashto is critical, but also how do you bring in the diverse voices from across the country? And when particularly strategically circumventing or preemptively navigating around the restrictions and freedom of expression, independent media, and digital access under the current authorities. So there were a lot of other reflections. I would say that this analysis will be coming out at the end of the month. And I think it will really provide some additional sort of insight into some of the concerns, including how do we ensure true independence in those who are leading the process, not just in terms of the individual profiles, but also within their connections and relationships to the broader international community to minimize the risk of politicization. I think, and I see my time is almost up, so I would say that the lessons that we've learned from the mechanism for Syria and Myanmar is around genuine inclusion being about co-designing outreach with trusted intermediaries, a dedicated capacity into the core team, and multiple ways to participate beyond testimony. We know that protections are essential to prevent re-traumatization through protocols, informed consent that is real, as Richard mentioned, do no harm sequencing. And then finally, this question around retaliation and how do you design this in protocols, particularly around anonymity, data sharing, minimization, and storage of data as well. I think finally, I would just mention that at this moment, we have a critical moment to both design, but it's an iterative responsibility. And I think we will depend on improving this access that Afghan women will have to be able to inform what it is that this mechanism needs to evolve into to be able to fully achieve its mandate and its vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Akila. Very interesting insights, particularly in terms of how other countries like Myanmar and Syria have been trying to influence the mechanisms so that their voices are being heard. And I also see in the chat that many of our sisters are writing about the fact that they want to participate in this process. They want to know how to participate in this process. So what is also very important for all of us is to show that way, to show that pathway to our colleagues and sisters in Afghanistan and men as well on how they can actually share the data, the documentation, anything, or their daily stories. Like we all get like numerous number of stories, everyday experiences. Right now, I've been just getting so many messages from sisters in Herat. There's a mass arrest of women by the Taliban, what is it called? The Amr bil Maruf, the Vice and Virtue. And they have been arresting women from even ages of 12 and until, women of 60, 70 years of age who have been wearing not that blue burqa. so that has become such an important, reminder for all of us that the situation in Afghanistan needs that documentation. And that takes us to further, questions and kind of pathways to understand that. How do we do the documentation properly rather than endless documentations that make people so tired? So I'd like to invite Ms. Akila Radhakrishnan to tell us a bit of how that documentation looks like, which kind of pathways exist to use the documentation, and also any intersection between these different legal pathways that we keep hearing Richard talk about it. There is an ICC, there is an ICJ, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court. There are this universal jurisdiction that we hardly hear about them. There are many other sort of even hybrid mechanisms and tribunals and whatnot. So please give us a clear picture of what do you see this whole Pandora box, and giving us an insight from your side. Ms. Akila, the floor is yours.
And really thank you again to the organizers, instigating this really important conversation and to having me participate, and to all my co-panelists. I apologize, it's been a long week of talking, so my voice is a little off. So I think, is so important. And I have, like Amrita, actually worked with some of the other mechanisms that exist on this. So I'm also going to be reflecting a little bit more broadly on what those experiences kind of tell me about what we need to be doing. So I think, the first piece of this is really about the extraordinary situation of gender-based oppression in Afghanistan, and that has to inform all documentation strategies, right? So how gender competency is actually integrated and included, and gender expertise is integrated and included into documentation. And so I want to, start kind of by level setting. Gender isn't synonymous with women. It's not synonymous with sexual violence, right? And we see this really playing out in the situation in Afghanistan. Gender isn't something that just defines the categories of harm. So is it rape? Is it forced? Actually something that also helps us understand the means and manner. Why is a man being targeted with arbitrary arrest and torture? Why are women being targeted for particular types of harm and particular types of crime? And so that's also really important to keep in mind as we think about what is the documentation telling us and what are we including? Because if we degender, for example, the documentation of the crimes that are occurring against men, we're actually losing some of the context of understanding the situation in Afghanistan that can help us, and for example, help us evidence some of the discriminatory intent that comes up under persecution or gender apartheid. And so I feel like that's a really important part. And I do want to say that when you look at the request for the post, so the budget request that was submitted and the posts that were approved, there is actually no gender expert post that's included in the list, which is, from a typical perspective of these mechanisms, that's usually a position where they have at least. Now, that can be mitigated, but it is something that does need to be focused on in the advocacy. We need to ensure that everybody who now works for this mechanism has gendered competence, right? And the Syria mechanism has put forward, Amrita referenced it, but they actually have a really excellent and comprehensive strategy that they've published on how they've approached this issue of gender competency. And so, I think this needs to be there, first of all, starting with the head of the mechanism, must have a strong background in gender expertise, because that is going to define the scope of how the mechanism operates, what is prioritized, what is documented, what is understood. And the two current heads of the Syria and the Myanmar mechanism are excellent prosecutors and experts who don't necessarily actually have a gender background. And so I think that's something that for this context is really important that we all keep in mind in our own advocacy, because it's not going to be possible to build strong cases around this extraordinary situation of gender-based oppression in Afghanistan if there is not sufficient gender competence and gender expertise, right? And so that's something that's there. It needs to be in the head. It also is something that needs to be considered across the posts that are being hired. And so, for example, the Syria mechanism in their strategy talk about how they integrate gender competence throughout its staffing structure, work processes, and continually provide training and these issues. They also make sure that specialized expertise is prioritized when they're looking at the selection of who is going to be staffing. So I think that in the context where particularly there will be no gender expert or gender experts who are currently under the approved staff posts, this is something that we really need to focus on. Another aspect I just want to, thinking about what should be documented. Often when we think about documentation, we think about the documentation for international criminal purposes. The evidence is quite high. The resolution establishing the mechanism very specifically also calls for the documentation of international human rights violations. And this is particularly important when we think about the fact that if there is to be a case at the International Court of Justice, unlike many other cases that may go to the court that we see under genocide, for example, this is going to be a case under a human rights treaty. And so we also need to be thinking about not setting unnecessarily high evidentiary thresholds for the entirety of the documentation, because that is not necessary. And I think this is also something to think about for the civil society partners who plan to, who've been doing such excellent documentation work already, and think about how and on what they're going to cooperate with the mechanism. But I also want to flag, for example, in the context of both Syria and Myanmar, where there are ICJ cases that are going on under the the Convention Against Torture and under the Genocide Convention, they were able to actually rely on extensive reporting that had been already done publicly by fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry. And here we have Richard's excellent work. That is an amazing place to start, but there are the states that are bringing these cases forward actually do not have those types of UN documentation to rely on. So it's really important that the mechanism is able to mobilize quite quickly to start building this document base to support the initial steps even in any other potential accountability proceedings. I see that my time is almost done. I just want to make one more point from the experience. And Amrita has reflected a little bit on this, but the importance of structured cooperation and accountability back to civil society. In the early days of these other two mechanisms, there was a lot of frustration because there was no communication to the CSOs. So civil society would submit documentation and they would hear nothing back about how it was being used. Because they were building case files for courts, often these mechanisms would not provide public information or engage in conversations with the community about their activities, what they're focused on. We've seen that shift, and I'm happy to provide some examples. But I think that insisting from the beginning that a really strong and structured relationship is developed to civil society, particularly, is going to be incredibly important. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Akila. These are very important points, and particularly as we engage with the Human Rights Council on the independent investigative mechanism, these points like having a gender expert, on the team is so crucial to understand that intersectionality that we are talking about. And as like you mentioned, in terms of the areas of documentation and the importance of expectations and kind of, and Richard too has been talking about it. How do we manage expectations? Because I remember when this the mechanism was announced, a lot of people, like particularly colleagues in Afghanistan, were like, okay, will there be bombing that would happen? Would there be, a big consequence that would happen? But that's important to understand that, these international mechanisms, we share information with them, we give our documentation to them. What happens with that takes a long process. Sometimes it turns out as a accountability mechanism, sometimes maybe a court case at the ICC, or International Court of Justice, sometimes maybe a court case with the ICJ in terms of any treaty violation. But at the end of the day, it's a very long process and also very complicated. And I see frustrations that many of our sisters and brothers have been also experiencing and sharing and expressing. And all of this is very political. And that takes us to the deputy rep for Afghanistan mission to Geneva, Mr. Taib. What do you think, Mr. Taib, in terms of states and international actors, as you have been working in Geneva, how do they see the accountability for Afghanistan? Is just a political slogan, or you see it further than that? And any political barriers that you can point, and then any other, insight that you can give to civil society, diaspora, all of us who are trying to bring in, some sort of hope for justice in Afghanistan. The floor is yours, Mohibullah Taib.
Thank you so much, Wazhma. Am I audible?
Yes, very
Can
well.
you hear me? Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who are participating in this very timely and important webinar today. Let me first thank FARAGEER for creating this opportunity. It's timely because nowadays the consultation is going on around this mechanism and how civil society can contribute. And I think yesterday was one of the deadlines for these contributions. And today we have this very important discussion. I also want to thank the previous speakers, which they made my work really easier than what I was expecting, and want to congratulate all of you, including the speakers and the women of Afghanistan especially, for their tireless advocacy. And as Mr. Richard Bennett previously mentioned, it was not really easy to achieve it in the circumstances we are in. But the tireless work of you paid off, and now today we are discussing how this mechanism should be and who should be the head of the mechanism. And in this opportunity, I also want to thank Mr. Richard Bennett for his tireless work and advocacy on this achievement. So, the states and international actors, there is a broad normative consensus that accountability for Afghanistan is necessary, particularly given the scale and systematic nature of violations, including against women and girls. At the same time, support is often conditional and cautious and is shaped by concern over scope, cost, precedent, and geopolitical sensitivities rather than disagreement with accountability. And you have seen this during the adoption of the resolution, which the mechanism resolution adopted without a vote. Accountability succeeds when evidence becomes cases, and cases find courts, not just when documentation of violations simply grows. This requires a collective ecosystem, a credible mechanism, operationally committed states, engaged civil society, and jurisdictions ready to act. The mechanism is therefore not an end itself, but a shared responsibility platform on that demands political courage beyond principle. Accountability for Afghanistan should be understood as a forward-looking, building deterrence, preserving truth, and enabling future justice when conditions permit. Digital evidence and survivors' trust is necessary, but only if designed with protection, legality, and dignity at the core. The credibility of the international system itself is implicated when and whether this mechanism is allowed to succeed. About the barriers that you have talked in, I think the most serious risk is symbolic endorsement without follow-through. Underfunding, short-term staffing, and absence of seconded expertise. Without sustained resourcing and qualified investigators, analysts, and technologists, these mechanisms risks becoming slow, overstretched, and vulnerable. Delegitimization narratives can weaken its legitimacy and effectiveness, where claims of selectivity, politicization, or mandate overreach can weaken political cover if not actively countered by states. Inadequate digital security architecture exposes survivors and civil society to reprisals, surveillance, and cross-border intimidation. Breach, leaks, or unsafe disclosure practices may undermine trust and participation. About the leverage, success must be measured by prosecutorial readiness, not volume of documentation. Evidence collection must be structured from the outset for ICCUs, including universal jurisdiction or hybrid proceedings, as well as admissibility standards. That means building draft legal analysis and case files early so that when prosecutorial windows open, jurisdictions are not starting from zero, but files early can move efficiently within the legal avenues available for Afghanistan's context, especially given the gender-related investigation in Afghanistan. Digital evidence is core legal asset in access concentrate contexts like Afghanistan. Properly verified OSINT, satellite imagery, platform-based material, and digital testimonies can bridge significant access gaps, but only if backed by strong digital forensics and information management capacities. Investing in this system is therefore not just a technical support, but a legal necessity. Protection today is as much digital as physical, from metadata exposure to online harassment and cross-border surveillance. Wazhma, if you may allow, I will tell a little bit how the civil society and Afghan diaspora and survivor can meaningfully strengthen the mechanism. Then I will close there and I will let you to proceed. Civil society and diaspora actors are essential evidentiary partners. But how evidence is gathered matters as much as what is gathered. Engagement should follow clear do no harm principle to ensure that information collected is legally usable. Impact depends less on the volume of documentation and more on coordination, standardization, and admissibility. Common protocols for secure collection, verification, storage, and refill of information help reduce duplication, protect sensitive data, and ensure that evidence can actually be relied upon by investigators and prosecutors when needed. Evidence collection strategies and documentation must reflect the intersectional nature of harm in Afghanistan. Violations should not be treated in isolation, but understood as layered and cumulative shift by gender, disability, ethnicity, displacement, and socio-economic exclusion over decades. I stop here, Wazhma, and I will be ready to answer any question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Taib, for giving us, another view of how the political aspect of the mechanism would actually kind of unfold, and particularly some of the, how different power politics would impact and some of the obstacles, as well as your advice for civil society organizations on the ground. So now after 4 years, for 4 years, Afghan women their allies outside Afghanistan have been advocating for the international community that what's happening to us is not normal. We cannot go to school, we cannot go to work, we are being beaten, there is no way we can actually get any support. And then the UN and the Human Rights Council agreed to have this mechanism, or they adopted the resolution that said, okay, there should be an investigation into these human rights violations. But that has been, the impact of the work Richard has been doing as a special rapporteur for human rights, UNAMA has been documenting, and hundreds of civil society organizations and activists in Afghanistan and outside have been writing, documenting, advocating, and speaking about what's going on in Afghanistan. So Afghan women have been very much active actors in this process. Now we have the mechanism. The 2026 would be the first year. Some positions have been filled for this mechanism. They need a lot of money for it. Where would that money come from? We don't know yet. Some position posts have been announced. Some more positions would come. These are the people who would work with the women of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan and the men to actually document what's going on. So I wanted to give that picture to particularly our colleagues in Afghanistan so that they have a clear understanding of where we are. But I want to come back to our panelists, and in 2 minutes, I know it's a very short time, in 2 minutes, tell us that in 2026, what is one thing that can be done to make this mechanism as a success or succeed? So maybe Akila, we can start with you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think, one of the most important things is really to think about how quickly the mechanism can be operationalized, right? It's not just, filling the posts. So in the previous mechanisms, they had to contract for databases, to really think about the technical aspects of what it means to actually be enabled to collect information, process information, and hold on to it. And so I think really to think about what are the lessons learned, how can the existing mechanisms be about how to get this moving. So I think that's one of the first things that we need to really think about. I think the second piece that's incredibly important is really this advocacy to ensure that the recruitment process ensures that the head of the mechanism has significant gender expertise. Because I really, really think that it's incredibly important that for a situation like Afghanistan, that is something that is a fundamental grounding in what they're able to do. So I think that as soon as we can see the terms of reference and it's posted. And the third thing really is to encourage states. We had a meeting yesterday, actually, and they said that, the voluntary trust fund has no, there's been conversations, but there's been no money. So I think to really think about how to encourage states to give voluntary funding now to really help seed a successful mechanism from the start.
Thank you so much, Akila. These are very, very practical suggestions. Dr. Amrita, tell us that's one thing that you think would make or we can do, all of us, to make the mechanism as a success in 2026.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think probably similar to Akila, and maybe I'll step over the one as well, is I think just to recognize that in order to be survivor-centered by way of design and then action is actually right now to recognize not just the importance of the expertise, but also the nature of the profiles of the experts in the team, because we know the complex ethnic, political, social, and deeply gendered context in Afghanistan means that, in fact, the trust building that is an absolute prerequisite for a survivor-centered approach will depend on the credibility of the leadership and the team. And the second part I'd mention is sort of related, is that it is such a politically fraught context that this mechanism is being birthed into. And there are always going to be pressures from any of the appointed leadership to actually be able to demonstrate, here's the evidence, we're making progress. And I would caution against that and say, in fact, from the very beginning, this privileging of protection against retaliation and what it is to actually ensure a safety of participation for survivors is going to require this moral clarity around holding the line on the integrity of the way in which the mechanism will engage with survivors and civil society. So I think that can also be embedded in the way in which those recruitment processes and the TORs are designed.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Taib, what is that one thing or two things from your side that we could do in 2026 to make it a success?
I think, as previous speakers said, there is two important things right now. One is the issue of budget. So advocacy should be continued, that we should have that, the necessary budget for this mechanism to get operationalized. The second thing, I think Akila just said, that there is a discussion going on the terms of reference and how it's going. So civil society already they submit some of their views probably by yesterday, but there is still opportunity that we can contribute to this. And the important point from my perspective is how we can get really people involved to support, what the terms of reference for this mechanism is expecting from victims, from people, from civil society. I remember at the first days of August 2021, so the scope of violation was really bad, and still it's bad. But if you see the number of information which received by different special procedures of Human Rights Council, it was really less. And I had this conversation with almost all of thematic special procedural mandate holders. That why is this? One of the problem is that the people of Afghanistan, in terms of language barriers, technicality, whatever. So how we can help them that they can get easily access to the mechanism.
Thank you so much. And Richard, what do you think? What is that silver bullet? Or is there a silver bullet?
There's no silver bullet, but I would just begin by saying that I agree with all of the other panelists who've spoken before me. And I'll just make a couple more additions to what they say. I've been looking at the chat, and I think the first thing is that the mechanism must be relevant for women and men in Afghanistan, and it must be gender competent and gender responsive. Others have made that point as well. And I've said already that it's not a panacea. Even accountability is not a panacea. The chat is saying, many people are saying, we know this is a long-term process, and you said it as well at the beginning, Wazhma, but there is an evolving human rights situation. There are violations happening every day. How do we stop them? So accountability, I strongly believe, is a way to stop them, because one of the reasons they're happening is that Afghanistan has had decades, actually most of our lives, even my life, of impunity, of there being no consequences for wrongdoing, especially for human rights violations and other serious crimes. So that if there are no consequences for doing wrong, you keep doing wrong. And so that is one thing. But there does also need to be other mechanisms in addition to this one to help change the lives of people in Afghanistan. I agree with adequate resourcing. I agree completely the importance of the leadership and the selection. I agree it must be accessible to civil society in Afghanistan. And I want to end with a little bit of good news. In response to Akila, I've been talking to some member states, and I know a couple that are going to put in some money. So I can't say who, but there was a regular budget, and I know there is a willingness for some voluntary funding, but I'm told that the trust fund is not yet established. So there needs to be a mechanism so they can actually give the funding. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. We have another 20 minutes, and I really want to kind of bring some attention to the questions, but also some of the perspectives and insights from our sisters and brothers from Afghanistan who have shared in the chat. And these are like mostly in Dari, but some are have written in English as well. Like, for example, one of our sisters from Kabul, she writes, "We are facing serious security risks. In many cases, we are putting our safety, dignity, and even our lives at risk. Yet, we have decided to continue this work. However, any escalation of these risks could make our efforts extremely challenging." That brings us to the conversation around documentation and how the documentation can actually ensure the safety, but documentation and the safety should not become an excuse to actually exclude people on the ground. And some of the questions actually that, so what I would do is that I would read these questions and then I'd come back to our panelists for each of you to have a quick 2 minutes reflections, because mostly there are comments than questions. For example, our sister Yelda writes, "As an Afghan woman, this mechanism gives us hope. However, many women inside Afghanistan are afraid to document violations. What concrete steps will be taken to protect victims and sources who cooperate with this mechanism?" That's one question. There's another sister who says the mechanism we are talking about is long-term legal case, but for the women that I work with, so many organizations on the ground, the crisis is happening now, every minute. How can this investigative work can be used to create immediate diplomatic pressure on the Taliban, rather than waiting for so many years for a court trial? The other question is, given the current context and situation in Afghanistan, you're fully aware of and informed about the problems and limitations. What kind of help are you able to provide? And another question is, how can accountability mechanism making sure that gender expertise is central, especially at the leadership level? That's a question that we discussed as well. Richard, for you particularly, there is a question. I've consistently followed your reports and statements regarding situation of women and girls, and I would like to sincerely thank you for your continued advocacy and solidarity with the women, especially amplifying our voices at the international level. My question is, despite the existence of well-documented reports, credible evidence, verified human rights documentation, and sustained advocacy efforts leading by you and other actors, despite sharing all of this, I don't see the rest of the question, but I'm sure he means, why don't we have an answer? Why don't we see an impact? And the last question here, I see it's also a comment that, like, you know, we are not asking for empathy or sympathy, we are asking for something real. And then I will go back to the chat where is a continued, you know, frustration that you can see, and these comments where people are, like, for example, I have a colleague from FARAGEER who is here, and he talks about the number of suicides. He says that in the hospital, he works in the hospital, and he says that 261 suicide attempts they have actually had in the last year, mostly women and girls, but also young boys. And also there is a lot of other comments about like mental disparity among so many of our colleagues on the ground. But what is something so evident here is that these women have not given up. These people have not given up, despite the fact that there is a lot of hopelessness and despair. So I would now come back to our panelists who have heard these frustrations and questions, and get any reflections you have before we close. So I'll start with Mr. Taib. Go ahead. And this time you have 2 minutes again. Thank you. And I'll raise my hand when your 2 minutes are over.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Wazhma John, and thank to all of these participants today. I understand most of them and what situation they're facing and what they really need. But as we all of us, we know that this even the establishment of this mechanism gets almost 4 years to that a political decision has been made by the Human Rights Council, and unfortunately the ecosystem and the international let's say ecosystem is somehow not in our support, and it's so obvious from what's happening around the world and what's happening in Afghanistan, and we are witnessing, unfortunately. But what I can say is that we should keep our hope. This establishment of this mechanism was not really a step that we can say. So, as Richard Bennett said, so we witnessed many of this injustice in Afghanistan, and many violations and perpetrators that they are, giving another opportunity, and no one sees justice. But today we keep that hope that there is a mechanism, and the documentation will be there, and we will get this opportunity to as a victims, and also to show the face of justice to the perpetrators.
Thank you so much. Amrita, what do you think, like hearing all these different insights from women and men of Afghanistan?
I think I want to echo, the sort of frustrations, and I think acknowledge that, in fact, what this tells us is actually a reflection of what we've already learnt over and over again, not just in domestic, but also international institutions, is that, as Richard said, this isn't a panacea, but more than that, criminal justice doesn't solve the systemic, structural nature of oppression and experiences of violations. And so what we need to be recognizing is that this is one tool that will have ripple effects. And I think particularly because of its mandate, the storage, we know that this arc of justice is notoriously long. So I think the other part is, what do we do now? It's actually, how do we use the existing evidence, of which there is a lot, to actually start to have more strategic advocacy that is political in terms of the response to the Taliban. And there is already so much of a gender justice coalition, not just around gender apartheid and the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, which I'm imagining Akila can speak to, but more broadly, what does this mean within the state system to be able to draw lines? And we know that this is part of the credibility question. The second piece I just mentioned is on this question of gender competence. So I'd had the privilege of being a gender expert on the fact-finding mission for Myanmar, and then working as a gender justice expert with the Syrian and the Myanmar mechanism, specifically on gender competence. And I think what's really interesting here is the stakes, as I said before, are so much higher. When you are looking at a context of gender apartheid, it would be hard to imagine how you could have leadership or an international criminal justice expert leading this mechanism that doesn't have this type of expertise, because it is systemic and structural and pervasive everywhere in Afghanistan. So, and as Akila said, these gender dimensions are multifaceted and they're intersectional. So let's acknowledge that this context requires that level of expertise. And that's the responsibility, to try and embed that expertise in the leadership of the mechanism.
Thank you so much. So Richard, before coming to you, I want to mention 2 points. One is that a little bit for our translator colleagues, you keep talking about panacea. What is panacea? It means, so just like it means a solution, right? A remedy. It's for all the difficulties and challenges we have, just so to make sure that people understand. And the other thing is, as you can see in the chat as well, we are not doing a very good job of ensuring that the information is shared with our colleagues in Afghanistan. And by we, I mean a lot of this diaspora international based human rights organizations or women rights organizations, because they keep asking, how can we get in touch with these mechanisms? So please tell us, how can we get in touch with these mechanisms?
Thank you very much, Wazhma, and sorry for using a complicated word, and you explained it really well. I will come back to how you can get in touch, but I just want to say a couple of things after the other panelists. I think we should not give up hope. And I really am inspired by Afghan women who do not give up. And others have talked about that as well. The second thing is, and Mohib talked about it, it was tough getting this through. There was only, I think it was the only new mechanism established at the last council session. It's unusual. And it was established by consensus, which means there is no opposition, which means that member states are beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation, especially for women and girls in Afghanistan. I looked at the budget documents in New York. A lot of UN jobs have been cut, 2,900, I believe. Only 25 new UN positions globally have been approved by the Finance Committee of the UN, 25 for the whole world. 10 of those are for this mechanism. That is quite an achievement. It means in New York as well, there is a recognition that Afghanistan needs these resources. So I think that's a positive thing.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Do you want me just to say about accessibility? I think we've had quite a bit of conversation on that already. But look, I'm taking it on board, and I think we all need, my mandate too, and I think everyone really needs to work harder on being accessible. Just on my upcoming report, I have been working with a survey organization who've reached out to more than 8,000 women in Afghanistan, and we've held focus groups and individual discussions in Afghanistan, online, of course, in 24 provinces and over 100 women. So we're doing our best, but we can do better on that too. Thank you, Wazhma.
Thank you. And Akila, coming back to you, what do you think?
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with the safety question because it's incredibly important, and it's highly unlikely, and Richard probably knows this better than anyone, that the mechanism is going to have access to the country. And we've seen this with the other mechanisms as well, right? The difficulties of access, and that means they rely on those inside the country and have a protection mandate or the ability to provide protection. So I think that for those who are evaluating their own risks, it's really important that you think about and prioritize your own safety. Now, the mechanism will set up, safe channels of communication and do everything that they can to try to ensure that their practices to collect information are done in the safest possible way. But there really does need to be individual agency here. There's often a pressure to, because it's important, contribute to these types of things, but do not underestimate your own personal risk and do not do things that would put you at risk because they're not going to be able to mitigate that. So I think we have to be very frank about that. I don't think there's really anything, to go around it. And as the mechanism gets set up, we can see what types of channels they're able to set up for the safe transmission of information, for interviewing. But really, I think from a victim and survivor-centric perspective, that just needs to be said. I also think that, this point of frustration is so present. Amrita and Richard, you both addressed really well, but I also think about, as these things are going on, the People's Tribunal, for example, was such an amazing example of taking the design of justice and the opportunities to think about what justice looks like for the community into the community's own hands. And so to not put all of your energy as well just towards these international mechanisms, the reason that we have the awareness that we do, even if we don't have the action that we want, is because all of you are doing, right? The documentation, the advocacy, and don't let these specific things moving forward become a distraction from you because you know what is the priority. And so that's so yes, look towards these things. Yes, look towards contributing to them, but also make sure that it does not become a distraction from what you know is what needs to happen. The last thing I just want to say about the cooperation with civil society, and I think maybe like setting this up, for the Syria mechanism, there's something called the Lausanne platform that actually set up a structured process. But I think that civil society should also think about what they want out of the mechanism to the frustration point of atrocities are ongoing. So in the context of Myanmar, we saw that in the beginning, they said almost nothing, right? They said our mandate is to build cases, and they did not communicate. But now what you see is they actually do more. They put out thematic reports on topics. They put out press releases when they think that there's a warning of atrocities. They put out press releases calling for information when something happens as a way of building this communication. And I think it's really important in this relationship between civil society that you all think about what it is that you want out of this mechanism, call for it, and ensure that you hold them accountable back towards you as well, because you can contribute to the mechanism, but what the mechanism can do back towards the community in this time and in the process.
Thank you so much. All right. I also want to express my apologies to the panelists. I've been kind of very much pushy with the time, but I had to. We are almost, done with our webinar. I want to thank everybody who joined us, the panelists, the colleague, our sister from Afghanistan, Latifa John from FARAGEER, and everybody who joined. Like we had over 100 participants, mostly from Afghanistan, mostly young women, mostly women who are actively working on the ground. And this itself is a testimony that Afghan women are like these amazing people who, I don't want to glamorize your resilience, but I have to say that the world can actually learn from the way you have been fighting all these 4 years. And this year would be 5th. I know the frustrations are very, very much there. I see every comment from my colleagues there saying that, okay, how does it help me right now? I cannot go to school. I cannot go to university. I cannot work outside. I'm being beaten on the street. What can this help? While this mechanism cannot help you right now, but if you are able to document, and your safety, of course, comes first, as everybody has been talking about. If you're able to document and work with an international organization or an organization that's outside Afghanistan, and I also see that you have been saying that you become our voice. But I want to say that we do not need to become your voice. Your voice is already there. We just want to amplify your voice and raise it further, because your voices are already very, very strong. So in terms of how you can access, maybe what we can do is we continue keeping in touch with Richard's office and his colleague. And if we hear any, for example, if there is a consultation that's happening, or he would also advocate with the mechanism to listen to these women, to listen to organizations that work with FARAGEER, with EPD, with WPSO on the ground, with so many others who are actually, having a lot of contributions. So in terms of expectations, again, I have to say, maybe it will take us another 4 years or more until the mechanism is fully established. But luckily this year, we got at least 10 positions that will be filled for this mechanism, which means some level of progress would take place. Maybe by the end of the year, in December, we would have a different picture for the mechanism. But please keep raising your voice and keep, making that's the importance of raising your voice. And I see Richard has also shared his email. Colleagues, please take a note. I know we all have it, but again, it's good to have it. And if you want to engage with the mechanism, please, this could be one of the starting points. All right, so here we are. Thank you so much. And we hope to continue this conversation. And good night to people in Afghanistan, and have a great day, everybody else. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, FARAGEER, and thank you, Wazhma. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and bye.